in exactly the same kind of behavior that goes ignored on the other side of town. These stop and frisk tactics are a big part of the reason that over 90% of this city's adult detention population is Black or Latino, and about 95% of the juvenile population. Now, I find that many people are willing to concede these racial disparities once they see the data, but even so, they say, well, this drug war, these tactics, they have a benign motive. You know, it's motivated over concern about violent crime. You know, it makes sense to wage the drug war in these ghetto communities because that's where all the violent offenders and drug kingpins can be found. Indeed, most people seem to think that the war on drugs was declared in response to the emergence of crack cocaine in inner city communities and the related violence. For a long time, I believed it too, but it's not true. President Ronald Reagan officially declared the current drug war in 1982 at a time when drug crime was actually on the decline, not on the rise. The war was declared before, not after, crack hit the streets and ravaged poor communities of color across America. President Richard Nixon was the first to coin the term a war on drugs, but it was President Ronald Reagan who turned that rhetorical war into a literal one. And at the time he declared that war, drug crime was actually on the decline, not on the rise. Now, why declare a drug war when drug crime's on the decline and less than 2% of the American population identifies drugs as its most pressing concern? Well, the answer is that from the outset, the drug war had very little to do with actual concern about drug abuse or drug crime, and nearly everything to do with racial politics. Numerous historians and political scientists have now documented that the war on drugs was part of a grand political strategy adopted by the Republican Party known as the Southern Strategy of using racially charged get tough appeals on issues of crime and welfare to appeal to poor and working class whites, particularly in the South, who were resentful of, anxious about, threatened by many of the gains of African Americans in the civil rights movement. Now, to be fair, you know, we have to admit that poor and working class whites really had their world rocked by the civil rights movement. Wealthy whites could send their kids to private schools, could give their kids all the advantages that wealth has to offer. But poor and working class whites were faced with a social demotion. It was their kids who might be bused across town to a school they believed was inferior. It was their kids, not the wealthy white kids, their kids who were going to be suddenly forced to compete on equal terms for scarce jobs with this whole new group of people they've been taught their whole lives to believe were inferior to them. This fear and resentment, anxiety, created an enormous political opportunity. In fact, in the words of H.R. Haldeman, President Richard Nixon's former chief of staff, he described the strategy as, quote, "The whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to," end quote. Well, they did. A couple years after the drug war was announced, crack hit the streets in inner city communities, and the Reagan administration seized on this development with glee, actually hiring staff whose job it was to publicize inner city crack babies, crack dealers, the so-called crack whores, and crack-related violence in the hopes of making crack a media sensation, which they believed would bolster public support for a drug war they had already declared and persuade Congress to devote millions more dollars to waging it. And the plan worked like a charm. Almost overnight, television sets were saturated with images of black and brown drug users, crack babies, crack whores, crack-related violence, and a wave of punitiveness washed over the United States. Harsh mandatory minimum sentences for drug laws and other offenses swept the United States, and soon Democrats began competing with Republicans to prove they could be even tougher on them than their Republican counterparts. And so it was President Bill Clinton, who was once dubbed our first black president, it was President Bill Clinton who escalated the drug war far beyond what his Republican predecessors even dreamed possible, And it was the Clinton administration that championed laws banning drug offenders even from food stamps for the rest of their lives, banning them from public housing, denying them federal financial aid for schooling upon release. To a large extent, it was the Clinton administration that championed the very laws that constitute the basic architecture of this new caste system, all in an effort to win back those so-called white swing voters, the Reagan Democrats, the folks who had defected from the from the Democratic Party in the wake of the civil rights movement. And so now here we are, decades later, and millions of people of color are cycling in and out of our criminal justice system, permanently locked up and locked out. But still, some folks say, well, this is a regrettable necessity. We've got to do something about those drug kingpins and those ghetto communities. But this drug war has never been focused on rooting out violent offenders or drug kingpins. Never. Federal funds have flowed to those state and local law enforcement agencies that boost dramatically the sheer numbers of drug arrests. It's a numbers game. They haven't been rewarded in cash for bringing down the drug kingpins or the most violent offenders. No, they've been rewarded in cash for the sheer numbers of people swept into this system. And the results are quite predictable. 2005, for example, it was reported that 4 out of 5 drug arrests were for simple possession, only 1 out of 5 were for sales. In 1990s, the Clinton years, the greatest escalation of the drug war, nearly 80% of the increase in drug arrests were for marijuana possession, a drug less harmful than alcohol or tobacco, and at least as prevalent in middle-class white communities and on college campuses as it is in the hood. But by waging this drug war almost exclusively in the hood, we've managed to rebirth a caste-like system in America. Now, I know time's running short, and I want to hear from the panelists as well, but I just want to identify a few of the most obvious parallels between mass incarceration and Jim Crow and say a few words about what we can do to end this system. The most obvious similarity, of course, is denial of the right to vote. 48 states and the District of Columbia deny prisoners the right to vote, but that's just the tip of the iceberg because, once you're released, you can be denied the right to vote for a period of years or the rest of your life. And here in the United States, we treat that as normal. People shrug their shoulders at that. But in other Western democracies, in other European democracies, prisoners have the right to vote, and there's voting drives in prison. But here in America, we take the idea of democracy a little less seriously. And in some states, you can be denied the right to vote for the rest of your life because you were once branded a felon. Exclusion from jury service. One hallmark of the old Jim Crow system were the all-white juries, particularly in the South, and the automatic exclusion of blacks from the juries. Well, today, if you're branded a felon, you're deemed ineligible for jury service for the rest of your life. And then if you've ever had a negative experience with law enforcement, you can be struck from a jury for cause. Good luck finding many folks in poor communities of color who have not yet had a negative experience with law enforcement that would justify their exclusion from a jury for cause. All white juries have been having a roaring comeback in many parts of the country that are quite diverse because of this system of mass incarceration, rendering so many outside of what we understand to be those who are full-fledged citizens. Employment discrimination. Virtually every job application's got that box you gotta check, asking the dreaded question, have you ever been convicted of a felony? Doesn't matter if that felony happened 3 weeks ago or 35 years ago, for the rest of your life, you've gotta check that box. I'm a felon. Knowing full well that the odds are sky high your application's going straight to the trash. Housing discrimination is perfectly legal against people with felons. You're barred from public housing for a period of years when you're released from prison, and you can be legally discriminated against for the rest of your life in both the public and private housing markets if you have a criminal record. Public benefits may be off limits to you. As I mentioned before, under federal law, food stamps are off limits to people with drug offenses. Fortunately, many states have opted out of the federal food stamp ban, but thousands of people can't even get food stamps because they were once caught with drugs. What do we expect folks to do? You're released from prison, can't get a job, you're barred from housing. In fact, if you try to go home to your children or to your partner who's living in public housing, they risk eviction for allowing you to come home. Food stamps may even be off limits to you. You can't feed yourself. What do we expect folks to do? Well, apparently what we expect them to do is to pay hundreds or thousands of dollars in fees, fines, court costs, accumulated back child support, which continues to accrue while you're in prison, and then in a growing number of states, you're expected to pay back the cost of your imprisonment. And then get this. If you're one of the lucky few who actually manages to get a job, up to 100% of your wages can be garnished to pay back all those fees, fines, court costs, accumulated back child support. What are folks expected to do? I say, what is this system designed to do? It seems designed to send folks right back to prison, which is what in fact happens the majority of the time. Most people released from prison return, and the majority who do so in a matter of months because the challenges associated with mere survival are so immense. Even so, many people tell me that's not even the worst of it. Many people who've been branded criminals and felons say all of that, all those formal barriers to inclusion, that's not even the worst of it. The worst is that shame and stigma that follows you for the rest of your life. The shame of having to beg your grandma to sleep in her basement at night because nowhere else will take you in. It's not just the denial of the box, but that look that flashes across the employer's face time and time again when he sees, oh, that box has been checked. It's that shame that causes so many people, branded criminals and felons, to try to pass. You know, during the old Jim Crow, light-skinned blacks would try to pass as white to avoid the shame and stigma of race. Well, today, people branded criminals and felons try to pass, not just by lying to housing officials and to employers by failing to check the box, but by lying to friends, to family members, to loved ones, trying to keep it quiet so nobody really knows. There was a fascinating ethnographic study done in Washington, D.C., of neighborhoods hard hit by mass incarceration. I mean, these are neighborhoods where every house or apartment or every other house has a family member who's either currently behind bars or has recently been released from prison. Neighborhoods where you would think that incarceration was just so normal, everybody would be talking about it all the time, who's in and who's out. They couldn't find one person in these neighborhoods who had fully come out to their friends, neighbors, and loved ones about their own criminal history or that of their loved ones. Child, when asked, so where's your daddy? Oh, my daddy? Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure where my daddy is. I haven't seen him for a while. Knowing full well that father's in prison. People ask by a relative family, wait, where's Uncle Troy? Where's Uncle Troy? Oh, Uncle Troy, he's out of town. He's out of town. Oh, well, when will he be back? Hard to say. Not sure. People asked, oh, where have you been? I haven't seen you. Gosh, it must have been years since I've seen you. Where have you been? Oh, yeah, I've been doing a little of this, doing a little of that. I gotta go now. Gotta run. I'll talk to you later. That shame and stigma has kept the communities, the communities hardest hit by mass incarceration, ashamed, silent, and divided. And this shame and blame makes collective political action next to impossible. So what do?